From the city of broad shoulders, this is Chicago Unscripted. I'm Bill Curtis. Here's your host, CBS News Chicago's Joe Donlin, who enjoys 3 fingers of Glenlivet with a little bit of pepper and some cheese.
The Winter Olympics are upon us, a one-of-a-kind sporting event that, over the course of almost 3 weeks, brings the whole world together in a host city and country. Deciding who will be that host is a years-long process, and vying to shine on the world stage has proven both dramatic and disappointing for a number of cities. Chicago was in the running for the 2016 Summer Games, and, spoiler alert, the years of work to land the games fell flat. Chicago made it past the other American cities in the running, but when it got to the Final Four with Madrid, Tokyo, and Rio, the first city eliminated was Chicago. A stunning and stinging defeat. My 2 guests were in the thick of it. Patrick Sandusky was the vice president of communications for the Chicago bid. He was the official spokesperson. He's currently the VP of communications for the NBA's Chicago Bulls. Ben Bradley was a reporter for ABC7 in Chicago. He's currently an anchor and investigative reporter for WGN-TV. 10 years after Rio won and hosted those 2016 games, I thought we'd look back at what happened. What was the plan for Chicago? The venues, the construction, the cost, the financing, the international competition. What was involved in pitching Chicago to the IOC? As you can imagine, it was a lot. Contingents from Chicago traveled to Rio, Beijing for the 2008 games, even Switzerland, and ultimately Copenhagen, where the winning bid was announced. Patrick and Ben were there at every stop. What was it like traveling around the world with Mayor Richard Daley? How did those trips translate into change for infrastructure in Chicago despite the outcome of the vote? Why Mayor Daley was all in on getting the games, plus Rio's bribery scandal. Did Chicago, as Ben put it, get out-corrupted in the end? What was President Obama's role, selling his connection to Chicago in hopes of landing the games? What about public sentiment then and now? There are certainly those who still think, to this day, Chicago dodged a bullet not getting the games. And finally, is there any chance Chicago might host the Olympics down the road? Let's fire up the Wayback Machine for a history lesson. They're both good friends of mine, and they serve as guides for our trip back in time through Chicago's quest for gold in 2016. Here's Patrick Sandusky and Ben Bradley. Oh boy. The last time they put a group like this together, they called it the Three Stooges, I think.
There aren't hats big enough to fit our heads.
Yes. Ben, do you still have my headshot up in your office?
I do. You want to see it?
I see Skilling. Look at that. Oh, look at that. Wow. It is still up there. Julie Unruh. Wow. Look at that.
With the wall of fame up there.
Yeah.
The wall of fallen soldiers at WGN. Not too late for you to come back, Joe.
Do you know, Joe, during I know we're going to get to the Olympic bid, but during it, somebody on our comm staff, there's a picture of Ben, and I forget who he was with, and they sent it to him as a nicety, and then Ben had the audacity to sign it and send it back.
Oh, is that not what you wanted? Forgive me.
And Patrick, you still have your Olympic gear you're wearing here. Is that from 16?
This is from the Rio games, I believe. Yeah, good call. Yeah. And I noticed on my bookshelf here that I actually have the Chicago Bit Book. So
wow,
there we go.
Yeah.
That was highly secretive at the time. There was a lot of speculation about what would be in the bid book, and the reporters were fighting like cats and dogs to get a copy of it. But you'll be relieved to know yours truly is the one who secured an early look at the Chicago 2016 plan.
Wasn't there an issue with the logo? I mean, didn't you have to change the logo at some point?
No, it was the slogan.
Oh,
no, it was logo too. We had to, I know we're jumping really far ahead, but it was after the domestic phase.
Oh.
The logo had to be switched because it looked too much like an Olympic torch.
Oh, that's right. What was the slogan? Move your soul or something like that?
Stir the soul.
Stir the soul. Sounds like a cocktail you guys might have had on the road at some point.
Well, I think the problem was some of the translations in foreign languages might have implied like stir your insides, which was why they changed it when they went from the domestic phase of the bid to the international phase.
All right, we have a lot to chop up here, guys. But before we do, let me ask you both. Pat, Trek, to you first. It's been 10 years since the Rio Games, which is hard to believe, and almost 20 since this all started. And what could have been here. Give me your summary, just a sentence or two, if you were going to sum up what happened as you look back on it today.
Yeah, I mean, it is 20 years since, more than 20 years, I think, since the first idea came. The Olympic bid was originally considered in 1997. And they decided to table it that was for the 2008 games, decided not to bid. And then it came back around. But I think that, it was a time where lots of things were happening with Chicago on the global stage. The president was just elected from Chicago. Chicago had sort of big plans on the world stage, and the Olympic bid was sort of part and parcel to that. So it was a time where you really saw the Chicago community get together, the business community, the civic community, and government all in lockstep, kind of going for one thing. So it was quite a big, at the end of the day, it was a big marketing campaign for Chicago because we didn't get the game in the end. But I think it was something that was, I certainly look back on fondly.
I think the Olympic bid really introduced Chicago in a new way to the world stage. One thing I always remember is, when you would travel, not even with the Olympic bid, but even, if you travel overseas in your 20s or 30s, you'd say you're from Chicago, and people would say, oh, Michael Jordan, or some would say, oh, Al Capone. and this was, I think, a big attempt on Mayor Daley's part to say, no, we're a new modern city. And I was always amazed at when we were traveling overseas for the bid, and they would build these elaborate rooms with, floor to ceiling pictures of Chicago's skyline and lakefront. How many people, including like members of the International Olympic Committee, these are not shut-ins, would go, oh, wow, it looks like Chicago's on an ocean. I thought, it was like a little lake that you were on. And that told me a lot about how Chicago needed to be reintroduced to the world.
When did you come on board, Patrick, as far as working for what was it? It was called Chicago 2016, I believe. What year was that? You must have been before, because as I recall it, or as I researched it here, it looks like it was announced officially in 2005. Were you already on board at that point?
Yeah, so I had just, it's sort of an interesting story. I had just moved back to Chicago from London, where I'd worked on the London bid for the 2012 games, sort of thinking that was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And the U.S. Olympic Committee announced that they were planning on bidding again for the Olympics. They had just bid with New York, and New York had lost to London, the bid that I'd worked on. And Mayor Daley announced that Chicago was going to explore this late 2005, early 2006. And I happened to make a phone call to somebody I knew at the mayor's office and said, we just got done working on an Olympic bid. Perhaps we could be of assistance. I was at a firm then called Hill and Knowlton, and they convened a small group of about 5 or 6 different people who had kind of come at the same time with hey, I've got some experience working on Olympic bids in the past, and initially had a meeting with someone in the mayor's office at City Hall. And when they decided to sort of bid for the domestic round, where Chicago ultimately was successful against Los Angeles in the finals, began then. So that was sort of 2006. I want to think when that really sort of formalized.
Ben, what do you remember about public sentiment at that time when it was announced initially? We'll talk a little bit later about how it ended up, but initially, what was the response?
I think initially there was a lot of skepticism because, there were 2 phases of the bid, the domestic phase where Chicago had to beat out Los Angeles and Denver, and
San Francisco. I think weren't they in it too?
Yeah. And, I think, we all love our city, but we were kind of like, well, the Olympics, really? I remember standing in Washington Park on the city's south side. It may have been the first time I met Patrick, and there was a press conference to say, hey, this is the bid, and we're going to put a temporary stadium on the south side because we want our bid to be focused on neighborhoods. And, I think Mike North, the great sports radio guy, called it the inflatable stadium, which tells you a little bit about how it was initially received. But then we beat the other U.S. cities, and the U.S. Olympic Committee selected us. And then all of a sudden, we're on the world stage competing against Tokyo, in Madrid and Rio.
Yeah.
And I think Azerbaijan briefly. Am I right, Patrick?
Yeah, they were Baku. There's a bunch of cities at the beginning that were sort of at that early stage, the IOC's early stage of the international, where they had Qatar and Baku and some other cities that eventually backed out.
So let's go back to the Chicago bid here, Patrick, and what this would have looked like, I guess. I mean, you had done it in London, but I don't know where you even start to put something like this together. What would you say was Chicago's biggest challenge as you look back out of the gate?
Well, I think out of the gate, it was not a challenge, but it certainly was a necessity where the mayor needed to get the business community behind it because they weren't going to spend any public dollars on the bid. So he immediately enlisted Pat Ryan, who had just retired from Aon, and to be the bid chair, who then effectively went around to the business community and said, we've decided to make this a priority. We need to raise some money for it. So I think first and foremost, they had to get the funding for the domestic bid and then ultimately the national and international bid. So I think first and foremost, it was that. And then two, I think it was then just at the very beginning, and this went on for 3 years, continuing to educate people as to the why and the what, because they hear Olympics. And to Ben making a joke about the stadium, one of the things we had proposed was a lot of temporary venues, which now has become more the norm within the Olympics. Paris was a great example of that. The last Summer Games, almost taking that blueprint of putting temporary venues in and around an actual city and its neighborhoods. But to get people who only thought in like big buildings like Soldier Field or the United Center to understand what a temporary venue would be and what it wouldn't be was part of the challenge as well. So it was a fundraising and an education.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know how you pick a number. I guess you maybe had an idea based on London or what you thought Chicago needed, but the biggest undertaking was what? The Olympic Village, which would have gone at the Michael Reese Hospital site. Is that? And then there was also, where would the opening and closing ceremonies have been? That would have been built as well, right?
Yeah, that was going to be as part of the stadium that was being built in Washington Park. So there were a couple different ideas throughout the bid. Things change as you go along and things evolve. At one point, I think swimming was looking like it was going to be, we proposed holding swimming in Douglas Park, but then got feedback and said, you know what, we need to have sort of a cluster in and around Washington Park. So they do swimming, diving, track and field all there. So that would have been where the opening ceremony would have been as well.
All right, Ben, you're covering this. You were born in Chicago, went to Homewood Flossmoor High School. You love the city, as we know. How do you watch this and not kind of just get all in, get behind it and say, you know what, this would be great for Chicago? How do you stay sort of, objective covering this?
Yeah, you are walking a fine line as a journalist. And I think the retired journalist from Channel 2, your station, Jay Levine, actually said it best. And he said, covering the Olympic bid is a lot like covering the Bears. You can hope your team wins, but when the coach screws up, you got to be the first one to point it out. And, that was how I think all of us approached covering the bid, which is, we can love our city. We can think our city is as good as any global city, but we can also do stories that say, do they really mean it? That there won't be any public dollars used for it? How will this impact Washington Park? What would these venues look like? And that's our job as journalists, certainly over like a multi-year story, is you're kind of explaining in steps. For me, what was fascinating was I didn't know anything about the Olympics, let alone the highly secretive process by which a city is selected. And boy, was that an education, I think, actually for everybody.
Yeah. How did that work for you, Patrick? Because again, you're not technically working for the city, but theoretically you are. And I'm guessing that you must look at this and say, well, we're better than all these other U.S. cities for sure. Did you feel at some point during this domestic part of the process that this was a done deal?
During the domestic process, no. I mean, all the way down to the final vote, it was close because LA, who is going to host the next Summer Games and obviously clearly is a capable city of hosting big events, seemingly was the favorite. The number of people at the time that voted, the people who voted on it at that time were the U.S. Olympic Committee board, somewhere I went to work after the bid. And only, then and later you realize like that there was a lot of people with California and LA connections on that board, including their board chair at the time, Peter Ueberroth, who was the chairman of the LA Olympics.
Right.
So no, we never thought it was a done deal domestically. That was a big win for us when we won that in DC. But that was just, really, when you look at the process, that was a very small step. Although I think that one of the things that hampered the bid over time was the length of the campaign, because, the U.S. Olympic Committee, after New York had lost, thought we need to have a more robust look at how a city's going to bid for the games, because there were some issues at the end of New York's bid where their stadium wasn't able to be approved what they had planned, and they had to move it to where the Mets were going to build a new stadium. So they wanted some more certainty, and so they needed they basically took a longer time, and that actually, I think, ultimately hurt the long term of the bid because of just the amount of capital, both human and financial, and then just the length of time where you're trying to continue to tell people locally and then internationally why Chicago. At some point, people kind of stop listening,
What do you think it was that pushed Chicago over LA? And then we'll get to the next step.
Honestly, I think it was the business community support tied to the government support. I think the ability that Pat Ryan and the board of directors for the bid were able to demonstrate. We had a fundraiser just before the end of the domestic bid, and I can't remember the number, Ben, I'm sure you reported on it, but it was at Millennium Park, and it was a massive fundraiser for the bid where we were able to announce that we raised X millions of dollars in private funds. And I think what that did, not unlike what Ben said, people internationally were sort of surprised by certain things about Chicago. I think that on the domestic level, the U.S. Olympic Committee was sort of blown away by just how supportive the business community was and how strong the government backing was at the time. And I think that, coupled with the fact that we had a plan that was going to be pretty feasible financially, not that LA didn't, and that they kind of have a similar plan going forward, but in terms of use of existing venues. But I think it was the business community support and the broad-based support more than anything.
Follow the money is what we were taught in journalism school. Ben, I know you learned that at the University of Missouri. What did you find when you followed the money and this promise that there wouldn't be any taxpayer money involved?
I think first, by and large, they kept to that. There was, the whole issue of the city having to step in to show the International Olympic Committee that they wouldn't have any problem securing the athlete village, which was going to be at the old Michael Reese Hospital site.
Right.
And so the city had to step in there. And for years, the city owned that property, even after the bid failed and had trouble offloading it.
Right.
But, listening to Patrick talk about Pat Ryan, and, here you have the founder of Aon Insurance, a true Chicago guy. He owns a slice of the Bears. He was good friends with Mayor Daley. And he was able to go to all these CEOs, the McDonald's CEO, like all of these Chicago titans, and say, I need your support. Let's do this for our city in a way that I don't think we see happening today. And that's not just a statement on, the current occupant of City Hall. I think it's a statement on, back then, Chicago companies were often headed by people who were here in Chicago, who there was a ton of pride in Chicago. Pat Ryan had those relationships and was able to galvanize them. Yeah. And I just think, a lot has changed in 20 years, also in the business community, where, you have, I think, different decisions made. I think a lot of CEOs and financial backers got on board with the Chicago bid because they believed in Pat Ryan, and they knew Mayor Daley, was going to, he was the fixture at City Hall, and he wasn't going to go anywhere.
Patrick, I remember you telling me at one point that Pat Ryan said up front and was very clear about how he wanted this to be on the up and up. He didn't want anything shady or any accusations of bribes or anything else. That was a big part of his pitch, wasn't it? And it's ironic considering what happened in the end.
Yeah, I mean, listen, Pat is, if anything, exactly who you think he is, in the sense that he is about ethics, and he's somebody who is, pretty straightforward in doing things the right way. And there was never even it wasn't even contemplated on our end. Like we were following the rules the way they were supposed to be followed. I think most of the cities were as well. I know that there's stuff that came out subsequently later about how some of those votes may have been secured, but
Yeah.
We did the legwork. When I look back at the amount of places and trips that he took and the leadership team took, and I was on, that around the world, to just meet with people where they were at. And there was a lot of different rules on where you could meet people, where you couldn't meet people. There was times you could talk to IOC members, times you couldn't. You could talk to people that were in sport federations that might have an IOC member. It was, the outcome of the bid, of us losing the bid, and the sort of public sort of upsetness, outcry, whatever you want to call it, actually changed a lot about how bids were in the future. It didn't immediately happen this way. But when LA and Paris kind of went into it, the IOC started looking at it a very different way of trying not to create a 3-year campaign where you have 5 cities that are excited about the Olympics and only one gets them. And then you have 4 losers within that race. So I think what's changed since then is that they basically looked more of like, do you want to host it? Do you have the capabilities? We're going to come meet with you and see if it's possible, and effectively sort of award a city based on the IOC's executive board decision versus this lobby multi-year campaign, which is what we were part of. And then, that's, people were spending in bid budgets. If you go back, this is 20 years ago, and you hear numbers, then I don't know what the final numbers were on our bid and others, but it was 50 to hundreds of millions of dollars of capital spent to not be able to directly pitch voters, except in certain small pockets that you were allowed to make short presentations on.
And that was no guarantee that you were going to get it either, right? Despite all that money. Yeah.
And they never came to your city either, which was sort of the other thing.
Ben?
Yeah, how ironic that Chicago, got out corrupted, given our history of bribery and graft and scandal. People associated with the Rio bid, went to prison for bribery and
buying votes, essentially,
buying
right?
Votes, and I do think it's fascinating that it never dawned on anyone from the Chicago bid that somebody might be doing this in a not above the board table.
I don't think it never dawned on us. I just think that it was something that, we weren't going to do things that were either unethical or, in fact, illegal to try to secure the games.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that we didn't know what was, we certainly didn't know the particulars of those things that came out later. But, it was something that certain governments operate in different manners of which the U.S. government does around the world. And it's not unlike when you go on a business trip in certain countries, they give gifts, and that's acceptable. Right. But here it's not, right? So
I remember doing a live shot from Copenhagen where the host city was announced, and Chicago was, shockingly shut out in the first round. And I remember in my live shot that night for our viewers back in Chicago saying, this is the one time Mayor Daley didn't do what he has done in, countless elections throughout his career. And that is kind of count the votes ahead of time, get a sense of who your support is. And that's not to say there was not a dynamic effort on the part of the bid team to understand where their support was. I just mean, like, you didn't really have an effective way to, to count the votes.
Yeah, you didn't know.
Right.
You didn't know.
No, and keep in mind too, and point of clarity that I've made for the past almost 20 years is that there was one city that won, but the way that they did the voting in those days too, it wasn't necessarily that Chicago was like, people would say, oh, you guys went out first. And it's like, well, that was strategic because we were a threat to Rio. There was a back, some people say a deal made behind the scenes for Tokyo to come back and bid for 2020, which they did. And trying to jockey votes in the first round to ensure, because the way the voting worked was the city with the least amount of votes win out first. And so there, and again, because the secret ballot, nobody actually knows. I remember when we met with the new CEO that came on board for the London Olympics, working with Seb Coe, and they had won by, I think, 2 votes against Paris in the 2012 Olympics. And he said that over the next year, he met, there's 105 IOC members. He said, seemingly we had 105 votes because everybody I've talked
And
to,
everybody told you they were in. Yeah.
they voted for us, even though we know that everybody but 2, we only had 2 more votes than Paris. So you never actually know, and you can make sort of judgments on it. But at the end of the day, there was definitely an undercurrent of, from Rio, our biggest threat is Chicago. We're trying to make sure they go out first because we don't want to be in a 1 versus 1.
Right.
Whether that's true, I don't know, but I think there is some truth to that.
All right. I do want to get into that, and we will in a minute. But chronologically, let's go back to April of 2007 when Chicago beats LA and advances. So let's talk about the pitch and what happened over the course of the next 2 years, Patrick, as you're saying, when you're out on the road internationally and around the world trying to sell this.
Yeah, there was a number of key events where you could go to where there would be, you were allowed to talk to IOC members and other people that were influential around those members that ultimately decided whether that staff, people from big sports federations, and a lot of that was around major events like the Pan Am Games happened to be in Rio in 2007.
Mm-hmm.
So that was right after we won against LA, and the Pan Am Games were happening in, I think it was sort of the fall of 2007. And we took a trip as the Chicago Olympic bid to Rio to talk to all the people in South America around it. And also, to be honest, and Ben was there, sort of see what we were up against in Rio.
Yeah.
Right. And then you had that again happen with the 2008 Olympics in Beijing. And there were other events throughout the calendar year that would be major world championships, major Olympic meetings, and so forth, where people would sort of gather in one place. And, the Chicago media were pretty robust in covering each of those steps, like going to Rio, going to Beijing, going to sport accord meetings, which I don't even know you would know what that was, Joe, but it was like a meeting where all the international sport federations would get in one place. So,
oh, wow, yeah.
So it was
Switzerland.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to say, what were you guys doing in Switzerland? Ben, let me ask you, because you guys essentially were traveling the world with Mayor Daley. Tell me some stories about what that was like.
Yeah, it was fascinating, right? Especially for, at the time I was a younger reporter in the Chicago media. I had not covered City Hall for 30 years, like, the political reporters at my station and others. And, I earned the spot covering the Olympic bid because I kind of out hustled everyone else and broke a lot of stories. And all of a sudden, I'd find myself on these trips to Rio with Mayor Daley, where he and I are, walking through their athletes village for the Pan Am Games, or, meeting the mayor and Pat Ryan near Copenhagen Beach for an interview. And, I'm like, hey, it would look better if we were kind of closer to the water. Let's do it. And Jackie Hurd, who is the mayor's press secretary, was like, oh yeah, there's topless women that are going to be in the background that we cannot, I cannot put Mayor Daley beaming pictures of him back to Chicago, walking on a beach next to, topless women in Brazil. But you really got to know the mayor in a way that I think most journalists never do. And I always thought that's helpful for me as a reporter, right? I could have conversations with him over beers in Switzerland, where you kind of understood what made him tick, why he was interested in the bid. And frankly, that has helped me as a reporter to this day. I've, continued a relationship with him.
Yeah.
And I think it helped our audiences better understand what he was all about and what the bid was about.
Patrick,
and Ben, I would say, sorry to interrupt, Joe, but I was going to say, one of the things I think that most people discovered from a public perspective too was that, Mayor Daley was the Daley family, this huge monolithic political dynasty. And you got to learn more about him on a human curiosity level, if you will. And as we went through some of these trips, and he was very curious himself. Like, he insisted in, he went to Barcelona to see what they did after the games and how they converted venues. We went to Athens to see sort of some of the things that had happened within that. And he was very not just I want this for the sake of wanting it. I also want to learn about how these have operated in different places, both positively and negatively, as we continue to shape Chicago's bid. So I think that was something that the public sort of saw him in a different light around that.
You must have worked closely with him, Patrick, but I'm curious, was this kind of with Mayor Daley, well, if we get it, great, or I really want this for Chicago? Where was he?
Oh, I would say he's on the ladder for that. I mean, I certainly wasn't on his staff, but I dealt with him a lot and traveled with him a fair bit. And he definitely wanted the Olympics. This wasn't just something to sort of do. This was something that they were very, all chips pushed into the table. We want this for the city because, as I said, he went to Barcelona and he saw what it did. Barcelona is a great parallel for us at the time because it was a city when they bid. Not a lot of people knew a lot about Barcelona. They used the Olympic Games to sort of, stimulate some parts of their town that were less well off at the time. Mm-hmm. And they kind of built an international legacy for the city based off of this 92 Olympics. And so he wanted that for Chicago more than anything, not just to have the glory of the games, but to actually, bring something that would lift up Chicago even further.
And even as mayor before the bid, he would always take ideas from his own, international travels with his late wife, Maggie, and bring them back to Chicago, right? Like the entrance to the metro station down by Harold Washington Library, right? It was made to look like a metro station in Paris because he was there and he said, well, why aren't our train stations prettier? So let's do that. He for years would talk about, flowers and planting and beautifying the city because he saw that on international travels. He was actually one of the first people I ever heard talking about China's dominance. And this is, 25 years ago. We were in Beijing for the Olympics with him. And we did a piece riding on the subway in Beijing, which as anyone who's, traveled to Europe or Asia knows, like their mass transit system and their train system is so superior to ours. And, he said at the time, well, yeah, as long as the CTA has these old school, local, engines that are, your Metro has these locomotives, you're never going to get high speed rail with the current kind of infrastructure we have for public transit. I do one funny story of the mayor, and Patrick's got a million of them, but we're on the subway, the beautiful gleaming subway in Beijing with Mayor Daley. And, we're kind of, our crew is the front, occupying the front half of the car, and there's 5 cameras and still photographers, and the mayor's, riding the train and looking around, and I'm kind of dropped back, and there is, a local Beijing resident who kind of sheepishly sees this commotion and says, who is that? Who is that? And I said, oh, the mayor of Chicago. And she didn't understand the term mayor. And so I finally said, that's Chairman Daley of Chicago. And she says, yes. And anyway, Mayor Daley heard it and, erupts in laughter. And to this day, I'll say, hello, Chairman Daley.
Tell me a good Mayor Daley story, Patrick, that you remember.
I think the two that stick to mind of just his regular humanness, Chicago-ness, and with one of my favorites was we were traveling back from, I believe it was the Barcelona trip, and it was just before Thanksgiving, and we were coming back, and he was sleeping behind me where I was sitting on the plane, and he woke up and he kind of leaned over my chair, and I was thinking, all the things on the mayor's mind between the bid and the city and the holidays, he's got to be pretty stressed out, and he just turns and he looks at me and he says, the White Sox got to make a trade. Just out of the blue. And this is in November, and he's just sort of there thinking about who's playing middle infield for the White Sox, because he's he's a Chicago guy like the rest of us, and he likes his sports teams. And I remember his wife, late Maggie, was said to him, she's like, Rich, go back to bed. He's only talking to you because you're the mayor. And I'm like, well, no, I find this quite interesting, but and they had a really great dynamic too. And he was such a funny, personal guy behind the scenes. I remember we were at some market where he had Maggie had bought something and Jackie Hurd had bought something. And then he's like, maybe I'll get that. And she's like, no, you don't need that. And he turns and he's like, oh, everybody gets to buy something except Rich. And just goes, and he had that like humanity of a human, of a husband, of just being sort of like, oh, okay, I guess if Maggie says no, it's no.
Yeah.
So, but he was, look, he was very passionate about Chicago. He wanted the Olympic Games and he wanted it for the reasons that we discussed earlier, just to kind of help elevate Chicago and bring the world to the city he loved. And you saw that in a lot of different ways, down to the sports example. I mean,
speaking of politicians, Patrick, the most powerful man in the world, Barack Obama, was on the side of this bid. Did you have a direct pipeline to him at all? Did you ever talk to him about the bid as the spokesperson for the Chicago bid?
I didn't have any real conversations of substance with him. Those were sort of managed through the mayor's office, through, we had late Lori Healy, who passed away last year. She was part of our bid, who had formerly been part of the mayor's staff. She dealt a lot with them. I know that Pat did, but he was obviously pretty busy, right? As the president.
That's true. Think about what was going on economically in the country at that point.
Correct. But he was obviously, the first lady came out for quite a while. He had a number of events with us at the White House itself. He came the final day of the presentation. So, he was supportive. We got all the right things, I was just looking at these bid books here on my desk, and we've got the letter from Barack Obama in there, photos with Mayor Daley. So, outside of the presentation day and a few events at the White House where I had, very quick interactions, if any, handshake or a photo op, I didn't personally have a lot of interactions with him. But I do remember when he arrived in Copenhagen on the day of the bid, we were sort of all really waiting in this green room, and it was all very, very quiet. And everybody's tense. And it was like the doors blew open and in walks the president. And as we're all sort of stunned, he just sort of belts out, I can't do a Barack Obama impersonation, but in the most Barack Obama voice, like, I hear this Chicago party in here. And everybody sort of relaxed, and he smiled, and it kind of brought everybody the room temperature to like, okay, all right, good. This is because you didn't know he was supposed to come. It was last minute, all that, and he did. He took the time,
and he just cut the tension, right, Ben?
Yeah. And his election, I think, helped kind of lull us into this sense of like, well, of course we're going to do well in this bid, right? Like, because the bid started before Barack Obama was elected to the White House. And I can remember, we did stories on, well, if Obama loses, that looks bad. But if Obama wins, that's going to hugely help Chicago's bid, because, there will be some on the International Olympic Committee who will say, hey, yes, let's give the Olympics to this new hopeful president who is being so warmly received on the world stage. And so when the White House made that decision to essentially fly him to Copenhagen for 12 hours to endorse Chicago's bid, everyone thought, wow, that's just one more thing that's breaking our way.
Yeah. Patrick, did you feel that way? I mean, the decision to pare it down to 4 came in June of 2008. So the IOC shortlists 4 cities: Madrid, Tokyo, Rio, and Chicago. At that point, how were you and the committee feeling? Did you think we had a good chance?
I think we always felt we had a good chance, but I don't think anybody ever felt that it was a shoo-in. And I think that, while we certainly, I think, put our best foot forward on convincing Chicago that this was something that could happen. And I think a lot of people thought we were going to win based on sort of the strength of the bid, the strength of the campaign and all that. By no means did anybody on the bid ever think like this was a done deal down to the last day. I mean, we just didn't know. And, those votes are so close, and they were close when you think about it. I think we were something like 6 votes lower than the highest vote getter in the final round, or the voting in Copenhagen. Then that's like 3 people switch one way or the other, and it could have a whole different scenario. And I, having then worked the next 10 years in the Olympics, I think there was a lot deeper issues around the U.S. in the Olympic movement that weren't related to the Chicago bid at all. again, there's a multitude of reasons why. I also think one of the things that happened very much in this, particularly the last year of the campaign, there was a growing sentiment around the world that we really should bring the games to South America.
Yeah.
They've never been in South America. And we were competing. It was Asian city, European city, North American city, places where the Olympics had all either happened recently, had been awarded recently. And they really, they had this very powerful image, Rio did, where they put up a map at a presentation and they had stars dotted all along where the Olympics were. And then they just had this shaded out of South America. And this kept pointing out, these are global games, and there's never been a games in South America, not one.
Yeah.
And that was a big part of their campaign, was if this is global, it should be global.
All right, let's get back to the vote in a minute. But Ben, I did want to get back to what we talked about earlier, and that's public sentiment. Because at this point, as I look back at message boards and forums, there was a lot of hesitation. There were a lot of people who said, hang on a minute here, pump the brakes. I'm not sure this is great for us.
Yeah, I think understandably so. With any major project, there is community concern. I mean, you see that in everything Chicago does. The Obama Presidential Center, right? Like, he could have put that downtown. He chose to put it on the South Side to draw visitors to the South Side. But you still have communities there concerned about, well, is this going to gentrify the neighborhood?
Yeah,
is this going to price me out?
Objections. Yeah.
Yeah. The Lucas Museum on the lakefront, right? Like, George Lucas was going to pay for that thing. Rahm Emanuel thought had landed it. And Friends of the Park sued, saying, no, you can't build something new there. So I think, anytime there is a major project, you're going to have people concerned about it. I asked Mayor Daley once about the opposition, and he had a good line. He said, here's the thing, I've learned. He said, I could go to the police union and say, I want to give each officer 10 bars of gold. And you know what the officers would say? Well, what? I got to carry that? Like, that's going to be so heavy. And then my back is going to have a problem. And, and so, he said that in a joking way, but it was kind of true, I think, whether it's the Obama library or the Olympic bid or anything, people understandably, want to say, okay, wait a minute, regardless of whether this is good for our city, how's this going to impact me?
Yeah. Well, Patrick, let's go to the vote then now, because I think as I look back on it now and research it, it seems like this was sort of a sympathy vote. You just touched on it a minute ago about Rio's bid and how it hadn't been in South America, and that meant a lot to a lot of voters, apparently. But it sounds like some people thought, listen, I'm just going to vote for Rio in this first round because they're probably not going to make it. And we all know Chicago's probably going to have the juice to advance. And in the end, that was not the case. It wasn't even close. What did Chicago get? Like 18 out of 90-something votes?
Yeah, I think the total number was about 6 votes between the 4 cities in terms of each one getting it. And I think there was some speculation too that Tokyo was lobbying, don't send us out in the first round because we know we can't win, but we want to come back. And if we go out in the first round, it's going to be really hard for us, in a sort of the save face culture of Japan to come back and bid again. So just vote for us in the first round. Chicago will be fine. And so who knows? You hear a lot of that stuff, right? At the end of the day, perhaps there was certain people doing things that they weren't supposed to be. There were certain sympathies one way or another. There's the idea that Tokyo really wanted to come back, so they got some votes. I think at the end of the day, ultimately, the message of going to South America was one that really resonated with people. And, there were other things at play that we've seen. So I think that, I feel still like Chicago did the best we could. I think we laid groundwork for the next American city that did and then won. I think there was also an understanding, like after New York, after Chicago, if LA doesn't get it, who the US may never bid for the Olympics again in the Summer Games. And I was part of the bid team for LA when I was at the US Olympic Committee, and there was strong conversations around like, you've got this is it. Like, we can't these aren't publicly funded initiatives. These are privately funded things. And if it's not New York, it's not Chicago, it's not LA, where is it going to be?
Ben, I think losing in the first round, that's what hurt. I mean, even people who thought, we're probably not going to get this, or I'm not sure I support it. But wait a minute, we got kicked out in the first round?
That was exactly the reaction, and nobody could believe it. I thought I had misheard in my earpiece, standing there in Copenhagen to report on it. But it was the most then Chicago response to it, because it was, well, they don't want us, we don't want them. Screw this. We're not. And I remember somebody said, asked Mayor Daley that night, like, well, will you bid again? And he just looked at like it was the dumbest question anyone had ever asked him.
So, Patrick, let's go to the scandal. I think, okay, we all accept the fact that Chicago didn't get it, but in the end, you find out that there was a lot of shady stuff going down, and people were getting even. Well, I don't know how. It wasn't maybe quite that overt, but there were definitely some things happening under the table that led to votes for Rio.
Yeah, and that didn't come out, keep in mind, for several years. I think even post perhaps the Rio Games. I'm almost certain it did. So if you think about this, that news didn't come out until 2020, right? Or 2018, something along those lines. So you're talking about a decade plus after our campaign. Yeah, it's disappointing when you hear things like that. And I honestly had moved on so much mentally. I haven't really gone into the details of what it was. I'm sure it's been well reported and well versed on the internet, but it's just one of those things where you just look back and you're like, there's nothing I can change about what happened at those days. It's disappointing that when you learn that stuff or you read that stuff, but I also, I think that it was so long afterwards. It wasn't like this broke within weeks or months afterwards. Yeah. This was like after Rio had actually even hosted the games.
It did give us an answer, though, right? I mean, at least you could say, well, to your point, I'm not sure what we could have done, especially if there was money flying under the table. Here you were trying to keep everything on the up and up, and in the end, that's what really, I guess, Ben, in a way, cost Chicago the bid.
I think there were a lot of things that worked against Chicago. I remember Rio's bid showing that image that Patrick talked about like you call this a global games, but they haven't been held in South America. I remember seeing that and going, oof, that's a pretty good case.
Yeah, good argument. Yeah.
So, look, it's a competition and we lost. Interestingly, because, you had the 2008 financial crisis that occurred afterwards. Maybe it was for the best. Maybe we got the best case scenario here, which was 2 years of plus years of marketing our city on a global stage, introducing it to a new audience without having to build the inflatable stadium.
Patrick, what's your takeaway? Because as I looked at Reddit and other forums, there were a lot of people who said, we dodged a bullet here. It's a good thing Chicago didn't get that. Do you agree?
I don't agree, and of course I don't agree.
I figured.
That. But at the same time, I'll say this: like the history of Chicago, and it was woven into the bid book, and Burnham quotes, and make no small plans. All that aside, I think that anytime you have an opportunity to bring a big global event to a city, especially a city, part of the reason why we bid for it was to raise Chicago's profile. I certainly agree with Ben. It was a great 3 years of doing that. But I think if you look at some of the Olympic Games that have happened in sort of Western democracies, like, the London Games, Paris Games, those have been seen as wildly successful and had similar ideas that we had in our games, which was this use of temporary venues. And I know Ben makes the joke about the stadium, but what Chicago didn't need was a giant track and field stadium that was permanent. I mean, that's just a fact. It's not something that I'm not saying we wouldn't be able to potentially use it and there couldn't be uses for it, but like it wasn't a need for the city and it wasn't something that we thought would benefit, but it was going to leave behind a small track and field stadium that could continue to have been utilized. So I think Chicago, when you look at what it could have been, I think it would have been great for the city. I think it would have driven a lot of investment into the city. I felt like that the games themselves would have been great. You pull, London, I lived in London and people there are very pessimistic about everything. And they had very struggle in terms of getting public support for the bid throughout the entire bid. And through the whole process of the run up to the games, people were also quite negative. And then they ran a poll the week after the games if they would had the opportunity to host the Olympics again, or it was actually a year later, I'm sorry, I think, but it was something like 80% of the Londoners were like, yes, absolutely. So I think once you have the games and they're successful, people feel a lot different about it. And it's easy to stand on the sidelines and sort of say, nah, we were better off not having it. I just don't believe that.
I look at it like Chicago can do anything, and it would have been an incredible legacy for Chicago. There were aldermen at the time who were talking about adding another star to the city's flag to honor the 2016 Olympics. And we do have to, I think, start thinking bigger and get rid of some of the, navel gazing that occurs in this city. I think about it as it relates to the current discussion about a Bears stadium. And what happened on the lakefront with the proposed George Lucas Museum, right? Like, everyone can agree Daniel Burnham's plan for the city was incredible, but you can't tell me having an empty Soldier Field if the Bears moved to Arlington Heights or Hammond,
even
Indiana,
worse, Northwest Indiana,
is a great legacy piece. So what I'd like to see our city do, frankly, is get back to some of what was done during the Olympic bid, which is where you have the business community working with the mayor's office on big plans and doing big things, even the stuff that some people said couldn't be done. Maybe that does go back to Burnham's make no small plans.
Patrick, is this a done deal then for the Olympics will never come to Chicago, right? I mean, we've all moved on, because it seems to me like now the formula is the Olympic Committee is circling back to these cities that have done it before. And as you well know, the argument against this is a lot of cities that undertook this were underwater and took a bath on this thing. And if you want to host the Olympics, you're going to be in debt and it's never going to pay for itself. So now these seem to be circling back to cities that have hosted before. Does Chicago have a hope of doing this, or should we just move on?
I wouldn't say never. And I went back and I was looking at the Chicago Tribune story when Chicago pulled out in 1997 of the bid for the 2008 games. And part of the thinking was that at that time, this is in that article, I wasn't working on that, was they were worried about, they thought maybe Durban in South Africa, and there were a few other cities listed they thought were more likely to get it. None of them were Beijing at that time. So just to show you how quickly the world can change from 1997 to 2008, when Beijing hosted, this games that was on a gargantuan scale, and it moved that fast. Who knows what happens 20 years from now? I could see a Chicago bid, perhaps. I don't think it's going to be immediate because LA is hosting in 2028.
Right.
And there's other cities past then that will happen, but they certainly could. I don't think it'll happen anytime soon, with the US getting the games in both LA and then in Salt Lake City for the Winter Games coming up. So, but yeah, it certainly could. It probably won't be for a while, but it certainly could.
I want to see our city succeed on a global stage. I'm not convinced that the Olympics are the end all be all that its promoters and our friends at NBC would have you believe. So, the question with Chicago's Olympic bid was always, hey, if we need to improve our roads, our mass transit, our neighborhoods, shouldn't we just do that? Why do we need the Olympics and all the other stuff that goes with it to set those priorities? The obvious answer is, you get some federal money and you have private money, et cetera. But I don't know. I'm always hesitant when we look at kind of one thing as a savior during hard times. Yeah. And I think, we've seen enough cities host the Olympics and have white elephants that I would hope that if Chicago ever did it, it's done in as thoughtful and responsible way as Chicago's 2016 bid was put together.
And I say what was great, a great missed opportunity for us in Chicago hosting was we had so many excellent venues that existed, and ones that people probably at the time didn't have in their mind, like there was going to be half a dozen sports inside McCormick Place with the main press center, with the broadcast center, and then sports right there on the lakefront as well in temporary venues. So that's a really dense cluster of stuff of things that already are there. I mean, putting a rowing right in front of Northerly Island wouldn't take that much work. And we have a lot of great venues in Chicago. I think we could still, to your point, Ben, we could host other events. It doesn't necessarily have to be the Olympics, but I think Chicago's still a city that when we host events, anybody who sees an event in Chicago, will say, boy, that city looks so much better than I had in my mind, or it looks different. It's on the water. And even the texts I got from people this year during some of the Bears national games of saying like, wow, Chicago looks amazing on national TV. I didn't think that stadium was that close. And people that we all know, and it's kind of confusing for us, like, what do you mean you didn't know? But there are, these are people that just haven't experienced Chicago the way we have. So I think we have a huge opportunity for events, whether that's Olympics or otherwise, who knows? And we continue to have all kinds of events throughout the city. I think the Olympics was just more of that galvanizing campaign for an entire city to be behind it, which was what made it different.
Well, NASCAR did that as well. I mean, the TV coverage of that race was spectacular. I mean, the city just looked phenomenal. Maybe we go for the Winter Games, Ben. What do you think?
Oh, we could do the luge off the Sears Tower. I like that. Yeah.
Hey, listen, ski jumping happened at Soldier Field in the Pan Am Games back in the 50s, I think.
Yeah, I think the toboggan run on Lower Wacker.
Yeah.
Yeah. It'll be perfect.
I love it. All right, Patrick, listen, good luck to the Bulls. It's last time the three of us got together, and always good to see you at the games. Go Bulls. And Ben, say hi to everybody over there at GN. Thanks for the time, gentlemen.
Joe, you're missed.
Thanks, Joe.
And I hope you'll watch WGN, Joe.
All right. See you guys.
See you. Thanks.
My thanks to Patrick and Ben. It was a busy morning for both of them. As we taped this, Patrick had a lot on his plate. The Bulls were literally moments away from making a number of moves ahead of the trade deadline. And Ben pushed his planned exit 15 minutes, so I appreciate their time and insight. Our audio engineer is Brian Griggs with Brian Griggs Productions. Chicago vibraphonist Thaddeus Tukes came up with the original theme music. And my thanks to Bill Curtis for lending his legendary voice to the introduction each episode. I'm Joe Donlin. I'll see you on CBS News Chicago. It's available everywhere on the CBS News app. And as always, I thank you for listening to Chicago Unscripted.